Billionaire was about to put on the wedding ring, then a black girl yelled, "She's using you." The ring had been sitting in his coat pocket for 11 days. James Whitfield had chosen it himself. Platinum band. Single diamond. Clean and simple, the way he preferred everything in his life. He had carried it through 12 business meetings, 3 board dinners, 1 transatlantic flight, and now, on Christmas Eve, through the iron gates of Oakwood Memorial Cemetery in Boston. Nobody knew he had it. Not his assistant. Not his CFO. Not the woman he intended to give it to. He had wanted to find the right moment, and he had decided, somewhere on that transatlantic flight, that Christmas morning might be it. But first, like every Christmas Eve for the past 4 years, he had to come here. The cemetery was quiet in the way that only cemeteries in winter can be. A snow covered the ground in an unbroken white surface that muffled every sound. The headstones rose from it like gray sentinels, and the bare trees stretched against the sky like hands reaching for something just out of reach. In the distance, the faint sound of church bells drifted through the cold air from the direction of the city. Christmas Eve services, beginning their slow rhythmic call to the living. James walked the path he knew without looking. Third row from the east gate. 14 headstones in the polished marble marker that still, after 4 years, did not feel permanent. Claire Whitfield. He stood before it and said nothing for a long time. The snow was fresh and undisturbed around the base. He reached into his left coat pocket, not the one with the ring, and removed a small poinsettia wrapped in foil, the same flower he brought every year because it had been her favorite. He placed it carefully against the stone. "Another one," he said quietly. He always said that. Another year without her. Another year of building things she would never see. Another year of the particular loneliness that comes not from being alone in a room but from being in every room and knowing someone is missing. James was 51 years old. White-haired at the temples, though he had gone silver young. He was the founder and chairman of Whitfield Capital, a private equity firm with holdings in technology, renewable energy, and healthcare that made him one of the 50 wealthiest people in the country. His decisions moved markets. His philanthropy had been featured in 3 documentaries. His name was on a hospital wing and a university library and a children's science museum in downtown Boston that was currently attended by 40,000 visitors a year. None of that came with him to this cemetery. He had stopped bringing his driver 2 years ago. He came alone, on foot from the parking structure on Beacon Street, through the east gate with the iron hinges that needed replacing but which he had never asked the groundskeepers to fix because the creak of them was part of the ritual. He walked the path he knew without looking. Third row from the east gate. 14 headstones in the polished marble marker that still, after 4 years, refused to feel permanent. Claire Whitfield. Beloved wife. He had not chosen those words. They were Claire's choice. She had been practical about everything, including death, and she had told him during the final months exactly what she wanted on the stone. Nothing elaborate. Nothing aspirational. Simply what was true. He stood before it and said nothing for a long time. The snow was fresh and undisturbed around the base. He reached into his left coat pocket, not the one with the ring, and removed a small poinsettia wrapped in foil. The same flower he brought every year because it had been her favorite and because bringing the same thing year after year felt like a form of fidelity that required nothing from him except the act of remembering. He placed it carefully against the stone. "Another one," he said quietly. He always said that. Another year without her. Another year of building things she would never see. Another year of the particular loneliness that comes not from being alone in a room but from being in every room and knowing someone is missing from every single one of them. He stayed for several minutes. The wind moved gently through the bare trees above him. Far away, at the edge of the city, the skyline glittered with holiday lights that had been strung across buildings and bridges and storefronts with the same cheerful insistence that Christmas demanded every year, regardless of what any individual person might be feeling about it. He turned to leave. And stopped. A child was sitting on the base of a stone monument 20 feet away. A girl. Young, 7, maybe 8. Dark brown skin. Two braids tied with a red ribbon that had come partially loose. She wore an adult-sized navy peacoat that went past her knees, and the sleeves swallowed her hands entirely except for the tips of her fingers. Around her left wrist, partially hidden by the oversized sleeve, was a worn red bracelet made of yarn, the kind a child makes herself or that someone makes specifically for a child. She was not crying. She was not cold-looking in the way that would have triggered immediate alarm. She was simply sitting, looking at the monument above her with an expression that had no business existing on the face of someone her age. James frowned. He scanned the surrounding area. No parent. No guardian. No other visitors visible in any direction. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you here with someone?" The girl turned toward him. Her brown eyes were calm and clear and impossibly composed. She looked at him for several seconds, the way people look at someone they have been expecting. Then she looked at Claire's grave. James felt a chill that was nothing to do with December. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's Christmas Eve and it's freezing." The girl pulled her sleeves a little tighter around her fingers. "You're out here alone too," she replied softly. The answer landed with a quiet precision that left him temporarily speechless. It was not used to being caught off guard by anyone. It was certainly not used to it from an 8-year-old in a cemetery. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily." She looked at his face steadily. "Lily Gaines." "And where are your parents, Lily?" She looked down at the snow for a moment before answering. "I don't have them anymore." The sentence carried no performance in it. No bid for sympathy. Used the plain, factual weight of truth spoken by someone who had long since processed the fact and learned to carry it. James looked around once more. Still no one. The bells from the distant church continued their slow Christmas count. "Who looks after you?" "My grandmother did." Past tense. The word did dropped into the silence between them like a stone. James was quiet for a moment. "Did?" Lily nodded. "She passed in November." He exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." She wasn't scared. Lily said it matter-of-factly. She said she had done everything she needed to do. Then she reached into the large coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Old. Yellowed at the edges. Sealed with tape that had dried and darkened with age. She held it across her lap with both hands. "Before she died," Lily said, "she told me that if I ever got really lost, I should find James Whitfield." The name, said plainly, without greeting or context, hit him like a glass of ice water. "She knew your name," Lily continued. "She had it written down. Where's your foundation address? She said you would remember her." James stared at the girl. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Rose Gaines." The name opened something in him. Not a clear memory. Something older and less specific. A warmth from somewhere he could not immediately locate. "Where have you been staying?" he asked. Lily looked at the snow. "Different places." "Since November?" She nodded. James pressed his eyes closed for a moment. "A month alone, at Christmas, in Boston, in November and December." He looked at her coat, too large, likely second-hand. Her shoes had cardboard-thin soles. "You're coming with me," he said. She looked up. "Where?" "Somewhere warm." It paused. "And then you're going to tell me everything your grandmother told you." Lily studied him with that unsettling calm for several more seconds. Then she stood, tucked the envelope inside her coat, and followed him through the snow without another word. In the SUV, the heater ran full and warm. Lily sat in the passenger seat with the envelope in her lap, watching the city lights move past the window. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who had been traveling a long distance and had finally arrived. James drove in silence for a few minutes. The heater filled the cabin with a steady warmth that slowly thawed the cold from their coats. Lily watched the city lights moving past the window. She did not fidget. She did not fill the silence with questions or commentary the way most children did. She simply looked at the passing lights with an expression that was older than her face. "How did your grandmother know me?" James asked. Lily kept her eyes on the window. "She used to talk about you and your wife. About the Christmas when everything changed." "What Christmas?" She never finished the story. Every year she would start it and then stop in the same place. A faint smile moved across Lily's face. She would say, "One day James Whitfield will remember the rest himself." James kept his eyes on the road. A traffic light ahead turned red and he stopped beneath it, the red color washing softly over the windshield. "Was she ever angry?" he asked. "Your grandmother?" "About whatever happened?" Lily thought about it. She said being angry at the past was like being angry at the weather. It takes up a lot of energy and doesn't change anything. James looked at the traffic light. Green. It kept driving. "What did your grandmother do?" he asked. "For work." "She cleaned buildings." Lily said it without apology or embarrassment. "Office buildings downtown." "She worked nights mostly." "She had a card and a uniform and she said she knew every floor of every building she'd ever worked in better than the people who owned them." James felt something shift quietly in his chest. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was the best person I ever knew." Lily turned from the window and looked at him directly. "She kept everything. Every photograph. Every letter. Every document. She said someday it would matter." James reached a parking structure and pulled in. It turned off the engine. The city hummed quietly outside. Then he lifted the envelope. Old. Yellowed at the edges. Sealed with tape that had dried and darkened with age. He slid his thumb beneath the dried tape. The paper opened with a faint crackle that sounded too loud and the quiet cat inside was a folded letter and a photograph. He picked up the photograph first. The image was old. Printed on the heavy glossy paper of an earlier era. It showed a Christmas party at what appeared to be a community center. Lawn tables. Paper decorations. Children in red and green sweaters. And at the far right of the frame, standing beside a woman with silver hair, were two people James recognized immediately. Himself. And Claire. He was younger. They both were. Clyde's hair was longer. She was laughing at something. He was holding a cup of cider. They looked completely happy. The silver-haired woman beside them was smiling too. She wore a blue apron and held a plate of Christmas cookies. James stared at the photograph for a long time. He remembered that Christmas. A charity dinner they had attended before the company became large enough to host its own. He remembered Claire insisting they stay and help clean up instead of leaving early. He remembered the cookies. He did not clearly remember the silver-haired woman. But there she was. Standing beside them as if she belonged. "Is that your grandmother?" he asked Lily. Lily leaned across to look at the photograph. "Yes." James unfolded the letter. He read it slowly, in the warm silence of the parking structure. The handwriting was careful. Deliberate. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who knew their words might be read many years after they were written and wanted them to last. Dear Mary Whitfield. There are some moments so important that they stay alive long after the people involved have forgotten them. 23 years ago, on Christmas morning, you and your wife Claire attended a charity breakfast at St. Barnabas Community Center in Dorchester. You handed out gifts. You stayed late. What you probably do not remember is a young woman who came in that morning carrying a newborn baby girl wrapped in a red blanket. James lowered the letter for a moment. 23 years ago. He did not remember. But something shifted at the edge of his memory. Clyde on the phone on Christmas night, talking quickly in the kitchen long after they had gone home. Saying words like resources and placement and she cannot go back there. He kept reading. The mother was very ill and could not keep the child. Clyde could not walk past that. She asked me to care for the baby temporarily while she found a more permanent solution. She promised she would come back after the new year. She kept that promise. She kept coming back for years. She brought books, winter clothing, birthday cards. She never forgot. Not once, in all the years after, did she stop asking. Every Christmas. Every single one. Because I declare, a child was not a project. She was a person who deserved to be seen. James set the letter down for a moment. He stared at the grey concrete wall of the parking structure ahead of them. He remembered that quality of Claire so specifically and so completely that it was almost painful. She had possessed an absolute, unconditional refusal to look away. From suffering. From need. From any human being who had somehow fallen through the cracks that everyone else pretended didn't exist. It had occasionally frustrated him in the early years of their marriage, the dinners that ran long, the plans that changed, the energy poured into strangers. He had grown past that frustration. He had eventually grown ashamed of ever feeling it. He kept reading. After Claire passed, someone made sure the connection was severed. Not by grief. Not by the simple erasure of time. By a deliberate choice made by someone with access to the systems and authority to use them. He could not fight it. He was a cleaning woman. He did not have standing in the rooms where those decisions were made. But I kept records. Every document. Every letter. Every photograph. He knew one day the truth would need proof. So I kept the proof. The last line on the page read, "There is a set of records inside St. Barnabas Community Center that will tell you who that person is. Follow the star. Trust Lily. And please, find out the truth before you make any decisions that cannot be undone." James folded the letter. He sat in silence for a long time. The parking structure hummed around them. The ventilation system ran its steady cycle. Outside the entrance, snow drifted through the lamplight in slow, weightless spirals. He thought about the words, "before you make any decisions." That cannot be undone. Rosie had written them not knowing when they would be read. She had written them not knowing who James might be, at that point in his life, or what decision he might be approaching. She had written them as a warning that applied to any version of the future where this letter finally arrived. He reached into the coat pocket on his right side. Closed his fingers around the velvet box. Felt its shape and weight. He had been carrying it for 11 days. Beside him, Lily looked at the window. She was not watching him. She was giving him privacy for something she understood was large. He let go of the box without taking it out. "St. Barnabas Community Center," he said. Lily sat up straighter. "Grandma took me every Christmas." She looked at him. She said it mattered. She said the people there mattered even if no one important ever came. She was wrong about that, James said. Clyde came. Lily nodded slowly. Yes. She did. James pulled out of the parking structure. The city moved past them, bright with Christmas lights that shimmered across wet streets. "When did your grandmother first tell you my name?" he asked. "When I was little." She said it the way she said other important things. Like look both ways. And be kind even when it costs you something. Lily touched the red bracelet on her wrist. She said, "If everything else fails, find James Whitfield." Why did she trust me? Lily was quiet for a moment. She said you stayed late once. She said most people get things and leave. But you and your wife stayed to help clean up. She said that's the kind of thing that shows who someone actually is. James drove without responding. But he remembered. He remembered Claire making him stay late at that Christmas event. He had been slightly impatient with it at the time, eager to get home. He remembered washing dishes in a warm church kitchen beside an older woman with silver hair while steam rose from the soapy water. He could not have told anyone what they had talked about. She had apparently never forgotten. He had thought it was the most ordinary evening of his life. For someone else, it had been proof of something worth preserving for 20 years. The community center came into view at the end of a quiet residential street in Dorchester. It was a modest brick building with a snow-covered roof and dark windows. A single light glowed from a side office. Above the church beside it, a star-shaped lantern at the top of the steeple cast a pale gold circle on the snow below. "That's the same star," Lily whispered, looking up at it. James looked at the steeple. Then at the key in Lily's hand. The 8-pointed star engraved into the brass matched the shape of the lantern exactly. They left the car and crossed the parking lot. Their footsteps compressed the fresh snow into quiet crunches. The air smelled like cold and wood smoke and the faint trace of someone's fireplace somewhere nearby. At the side entrance to the community center, beside the door handle, was a small brass plate, engraved with an 8-pointed star. Lily held the key up. Her hand was steady. The key slid in turn. A quiet click. The door opened. The hallway inside was dim and warm. It smelled like floor polish and old paper and something else, something harder to name. The smell of a place that has been well cared for by someone who believed the caring mattered. Framed photographs covered the walls on both sides, stretching the length of the corridor, decades of Christmas gatherings, volunteer days, children's performances, family portraits. Black and white images from one era giving way to color in another. The building felt less like an office and more like an accumulated memory. A place that had been quietly holding things on behalf of people who might one day come back for them. James walked slowly. He found Claire in a photograph halfway down the left wall. She was standing at a table of Christmas gifts, laughing at something. Her hair was shorter than he remembered from that period. She looked completely at ease. The kind of ease that belongs to someone in a place where they feel they belong. He stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Lily stopped beside him. She looked at the photograph too. She pointed at the small child in the foreground, about 3 years old, holding a wrapped box with the profound seriousness of a child who has been handed something important. "That's me," she said quietly. James looked at the two of them. Claire laughing. Lily serious. The image had been hanging in this hallway for years, waiting for someone who recognized both of the people in it. He kept walking. At the far end of the corridor stood a wooden cabinet. Old. Solid. Well built by someone who expected it to last. A carved 8-pointed star decorated each door panel, repeating the shape from the brass plate by the entrance and from the key in Lily's pocket. Tapped to the front, in a sealed envelope, were 2 names written in faded ink. For James and Lily. James lifted the envelope from the tape and opened it carefully. Inside was another letter from Rose Gaines. This one began differently. "If you are standing here together, the hard part is already behind you. You found each other. What comes next will be difficult. But it is necessary. Inside this cabinet is everything I kept. Everything I preserved because I knew one day it would matter." He handed the letter to Lily and opened the cabinet. The interior was organized with extraordinary care. Folders in dated sequence. Photographs rubber-banded in groups by year. Copies of formal documents placed inside protective sleeves. A lifetime of careful preservation. James began searching. Lily stood beside him, reading the letter silently, her red bracelet visible below the too-long sleeve of her coat. The first folder contained photographs. Clyde at Christmas parties. Claire reading to children in the center's library room. Clyde at a birthday party for a little girl in a red dress who was grinning so widely that her eyes had almost closed. James stood in front of these photographs for a long time. His wife had spent years here, in this building, connected to this child, attending her birthdays and reading her books and sending her winter coats, and he had never known. Not once. Not a single mention. How had he not known? He knew the answer before he finished asking it. Clyde had not told him because she had been waiting until it was certain. That was how she did everything important, she carried it alone until she could give it to him whole. She had never wanted to say "I'm trying." She had always wanted to say I did it. Here it is. For you. She had never gotten the chance. The second folder contained correspondence. Letters from Claire to Rose, dating back more than a decade. They covered years he had thought he knew well. The years of the company's growth, of awards and milestones and the particular busyness of being successful. Beneath all of that, in letters he had never seen, Claire had been writing to a woman in Dorchester about a little girl. Making plans. Following up. Checking that things were moving forward. Refusing to accept delays that had no explanation. The letters stopped in the final year of her illness. Not because she had given up. Because she had run out of time. The third folder stopped James cold. It was a formal placement application. Estate paperwork. Clyde's name in the applicant field. Dated 9 years earlier. The application had been approved at the preliminary level. Stamped and signed through 2 stages of review. Then stopped. At the bottom of the last page, a second signature appeared on a denial form. A name in a precise, clean hand that James knew as well as his own. Diane Hargrove. He's Senior Director of Philanthropic Operations. His most trusted advisor for 14 years. The woman who had organized every charitable initiative the Whitfield Foundation had ever run. The woman who had attended Claire's funeral. Who had spent the past 2 years quietly becoming something more than an employee. The woman for whom he was carrying a ring. James stared at the signature. He heard, very distantly, the sound of church bells. The clock somewhere in the building ticking. The soft sound of Lily turning a page beside him. Find out the truth before you make any decisions that cannot be undone. He opened the next page. Attached was an internal memo from 9 years ago, written on Whitfield Foundation letterhead. The memo cited vague concerns about liability and optics and referred the application to an extended review period that effectively buried it in process until Claire's death made the point moot. The memo was unsigned. But the style was unmistakable. James had read hundreds of documents Diane had written over 14 years. He knew her particular precision. Her way of framing objections in neutral language that was nearly impossible to challenge. He held the document and was completely, dangerously still. Is something wrong? Lily asked. James looked at her. She looked back with those deep, composed eyes. I need a moment, he said. She nodded. She gave him one. She was good at that. He stood in front of the open cabinet with the documents in his hands and thought about Diane with the kind of specificity that a revelation forces. He thought about the past 2 years measured not by what had happened but by what he now understood had been happening. The dinners where she had mentioned the foundation's future in casual, incremental ways. The conversations where she had steered discussions toward restructuring, toward flexibility, toward formats that would give her more formal authority over long-term planning. The way she had made herself indispensable so gradually that the gradualness itself had been invisible. He thought about the ring. He had chosen it and carried it for 11 days and told himself it was a good decision. He had told himself it represented forward motion after years of standing still. He had told himself it felt right. He understood now that it had felt familiar. And he had confused the two. He thought about Claire. She had spent years trying to reach this child. She had been blocked at every turn by paperwork that vanished and meetings that were cancelled and review processes that stretched without end. She had believed it was the system failing her. She had never once suspected a person. She had been too genuinely trusting to look for the human hand behind bureaucratic walls. And the person who had built those walls had been offering him dinners for the past 2 years. He thought about the ring again. Then he stopped thinking about it. Then the sound of a door reached him from deeper inside the building. Not a crack. Not the settling of the structure. A door, opened and closed with the specific quiet deliberateness of someone who did not want to be heard. James looked toward the dark hallway beyond the records room. Lily went still beside him. Footsteps. Major. crossing the old wooden floor at the back of the building. Then a voice, familiar and calm, called from the darkness. James. Diane Hargrove stepped into the hallway light. She wore a dark coat and leather gloves, and snowflakes clung to her shoulders. She glanced at the open cabinet, then at the documents in James's hands, then at Lily standing beside him. Her expression was controlled. Carefully, precisely controlled. But her eyes moved to the documents in his hands with the specific focus of someone who already knows what they contain. I was wondering how long it would take, she said. James did not speak immediately. He looked at the signature on the denial form. Then at Diane. She met his gaze without flinching. You knew these records were here, he said. I suspected Ruth kept copies. She said it easily. Calmly. As if admitting it cost her nothing. Lily stepped closer to James. Diane noticed the movement. Her eyes dropped briefly to the red bracelet on Lily's wrist. Then she looked back at James. I want to explain, she said. Then explain. She took a slow breath. When Claire filed that application, the company was 12 weeks from its largest acquisition. Regulators were reviewing every public-facing aspect of the firm. A sudden personal adoption, the timing, the scrutiny, the human interest coverage it would generate, any one of those things could have created complications. Claire was trying to bring a child home, James said quietly. Claire was making a decision based on emotion that would have had significant strategic consequences for thousands of employees and investors. And you decided to make that choice for her. Diane looked at him steadily. I made it for the company. Without telling either of us. She said nothing. James set the documents on top of the cabinet. He looked at them for a long moment. 4 years since Claire had died. 2 years since Diane had moved from the edge of his life to the center of it. The timeline shifted and reshuffled in his memory. He had assumed that closeness was comfort offered by someone who had known Claire. That it was, in some way, a continuation of something real. He understood now that it had been positioning. Not cruel, perhaps. Not consciously predatory, perhaps. But positioning nonetheless. Gradual. Patient. The kind that happens when someone decides that the best way to protect what they've built is to remain indispensable to the person who owns it. Lily's voice cut through the silence. My grandma never hated you, she said to Diane. Both adults looked at her. Lily spoke without anger. Without theatrics. She held the red bracelet in her fingers and looked at Diane directly. She said people make bad choices when they forget what matters. She didn't think you were a bad person. She thought you forgot. Diane stared at the little girl for a long time. Something moved across her face that was not composed and not controlled. Something that had been stored away for a very long time behind a layer of professionalism and calculation. She may have been right, Diane said finally, very quietly. James reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Not the left side. The right. He closed his fingers around the ring box, and then he took it out. He set it on top of the cabinet beside the documents. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the lid. He picked up the final folder from the cabinet. Inside was one more sealed envelope. On the front, Claire's handwriting. If Lily ever finds her way home. He lifted his eyes to the girl standing beside him. She looked back. Her expression did not demand anything. It never had. From the first moment in the cemetery to this one, she had simply carried the truth from one person to the next, trusting that the truth itself would know what to do when it arrived. He opened the envelope. The letter inside was Claire's voice, unchanged by time. Unchanged by the 4 years that had passed since James had last heard it. It arrived from the page with the same precision and warmth and slight impatience with sentimentality that had been her particular character. Dear Lily, I do not know how old you are when you read this. I do not know what life has given you or taken from you. I hope someone has been kind to you. I hope someone has read to you and taught you that you are valuable. Because you are. You always were. He tried to tell the world that. I'm sorry it took so long for the world to listen. There was never a Christmas when I forgot you. Not when. He kept every photograph. Every drawing. Every note you sent with Ruth. He always believed we would find our way back to each other. Sometimes life delays good things. It does not erase them. James read the letter aloud, slowly, so Lily could hear every word. His voice was not entirely steady. He did not try to make it steady. There was no reason to. They were standing in an old building in the middle of the night reading a letter that had been waiting for years, and the only honest response to that was the one he gave. When he finished, Lily's eyes were bright. She did not try to hide it. She sounds like what I hoped she would sound like, Lily said. James nodded. She was. Outside, the church bells began ringing midnight. Their deep, resonant tones moved through the walls of the building and into the records room. Christmas Day had arrived. The sound filled the space with something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like warmth. James looked toward Diane. I think you should go. She nodded once. She picked up nothing. She left through the same door she had entered. He did not watch her go. He looked instead at the photographs of Claire spread across the cabinet. Clyde at this building. Clyde with this child. Clyde spending years trying to do something that someone else had decided she could not do. He had not known. He had not known, and now he could not unknow it, and the only thing left to decide was what tomorrow was going to become. Christmas morning arrived in soft gold and silver. The snow that had fallen overnight lay clean and unbroken across the city. Church bells carried through the bright cold air, and Boston moved slowly into the day the way it always did on Christmas, with a kind of quiet that felt intentional, as if the city itself had agreed to rest for a few hours. James and Lily attended the Christmas morning service at St. Barnabas Church. She sat beside him in the pew. The red bracelet rested against her wrist. The brass star key was in her coat pocket. Around them, families filled the rows in the particular comfortable proximity of people who have been sitting beside each other in this same building for years. Children feeded. Parents spoke in whispers. Someone nearby smelled like coffee and pine needles. James did not think about Diane. He did not think about the foundation or the restructuring proposals or the ring box he had left on top of a cabinet beside a 23-year-old denial form. He sat in the pew beside a little girl who had spent a month alone in November and December, carrying a letter and a key and a photograph across a city that had no particular reason to receive them. He thought instead about Claire. About what she would have said about all of it. She would have said something practical and direct and slightly impatient with sentiment. She would have said something like, "Stop thinking about it and do the next thing." That was always her answer. There is a next thing. Just do it. What James felt that morning had nothing to do with business or reputation or the machinery of success that had defined every other Christmas for the past 4 years. It was simpler than that. Harder to name. The feeling of sitting beside someone who needed to be there, in a room warm enough to be worth something. Something like belonging. Something that had been missing for 4 years. After the service, they returned to the community center. James made calls. His attorneys. The foundation director. The state social services office. By the time they finished, the basic outlines of a plan had been drawn. A scholarship program, named for Rose Gaines, would be established through the Whitfield Foundation. It would fund education, mentorship, and emergency housing for children in the Boston foster care system, not because it served any strategic purpose, not because it generated useful publicity, but because it was what Claire had tried to build and what Rose had spent 30 years modeling with nothing but determination and a cleaning cart and a set of carefully preserved folders. James would pursue legal guardianship of Lily Gaines. It would take months. Paperwork. Reviews. Court. Evidences. All of the machinery that had once been used to delay and obstruct would now be set in motion in the other direction. He had attorneys who had moved mountains for business deals. They could move them for this. In the afternoon, they drove to Oakwood Cemetery. The snow on the paths was undisturbed from the previous night. Their footsteps broke through the surface in the same quiet crunches as before. The poinsettia James had placed the night before was still there, half buried under the new snow, a red point of color in all the white. James placed a second poinsettia beside the first. Then he set a small framed photograph against the base of the headstone. The photograph of Claire and Rose and baby Lily, taken 23 years ago at a Christmas party in Dorchester. The first photograph that had ever been taken of all three of them together. It had existed in a dusty cabinet for 23 years, waiting to be placed somewhere it could be seen. Lily knelt in the snow beside the stone. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at Claire's name. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the way the afternoon light touched the polished marble and turned it briefly golden before the clouds shifted and the light softened again. "I'm here," she said finally. Softly. To the stone. To Claire. To whatever version of Claire might still be listening. "Sorry it took so long." James stood beside her. It did not fill the silence. He had learned, over 4 years of coming to this cemetery, that certain silences were not empty. They were full of something that words would only crowd out. The cold pressed steadily against his coat. The bells from the city floated through the winter air in the particular way that sounds travel on cold days, crisp and clear, carrying farther than they should. He reached into his coat pocket. The left side this time. He removed a small box wrapped in silver paper. Lily looked up. "What is that?" she asked. "Open it." She stood and brushed snow from her knees. She unwrapped the box carefully, with the deliberate patience of a child who has learned not to rush the moments worth keeping. Inside it rested a delicate silver bracelet. A thin chain with a small 8-pointed star charm at the center. The same star as the key. The same star as the lantern above the church. The same star that Rose had said to follow. Lily stared at it. Her eyes moved from the charm to the key in her pocket and back again. "It matches the key." "It matches a lot of things," James said. She looked up at him. The composure she had carried all night, through the cemetery and the letter and the community center and the confrontation, finally softened. Not into sadness. Into something younger and less guarded. The expression of a child who has arrived somewhere safe and is beginning, cautiously, to know it. James helped her fasten the silver bracelet beside the red yarn one. When worn and faded, made by hands that had been tender and careful and gone for 6 weeks now. When new and bright, representing a future that was still being decided. One represented everything she had come from. The other represented everything that was still possible. They stood together for a long time. Long enough for the light to change and the first stars to appear through the clearing clouds above the Boston skyline. James looked at Claire's name on the marble. He had spent 4 years carrying grief the way you carry a stone you've decided to keep, not because it helps you, but because putting it down feels like forgetting. Tonight felt different. Not lighter exactly. More like a stone that had finally been placed in the right spot. Somewhere it could be part of something instead of just being carried. He had not come here tonight expecting any of this. He had come here as he always came, alone, in the dark, on Christmas Eve, to stand beside a name engraved in stone and say another year. He had left with a child beside him, a letter in his coat, and a ring left behind in a room where it was better forgotten. He looked down at Lily. "Grandma always said," she began quietly, looking up at the first stars, "that Christmas is when lost things find each other." James nodded. She was a very wise woman. Lily smiled. The full, unguarded smile of a child who has nothing left to protect. "I know," she said. The bells rang again in the distance. 1, 2, 3. Counting out the last hours of Christmas Day across a city full of people who were, in their various ways, trying to find their way back to each other. James reached out his hand. Lily took it. And they walked out of the cemetery together, through the iron gate with the hinges that needed replacing, toward the car, toward the city, toward whatever came next. Because sometimes the ring you were about to give is not the one that matters. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is smaller and older and simpler. A worn red bracelet on a small wrist. A brass key with a star. A letter written by someone who believed, against all evidence to the contrary, that the truth would find its way to the right person. It always does. It just sometimes needs a child brave enough to carry it there first.